Great. So I'm Dr. Earl Turner. For those of you that are not familiar with me, I'm a psychologist, as well as the founder and executive director of Therapy for Black Kids. And today we are having our first virtual conversation of the year, which is focused on community violence. So today's fireside chat is hosted by Therapy for Black Kids. Our special guest is Dr. Noni Gaylord-Harden. She is a professor of psychology at Texas A&M University in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. Her research interest has focused on stress, coping, and psychosocial functioning in African American adolescents, and also some of her more recent scholarship has focused on exposure to community violence as stressors for youth in urban settings. And so I am excited to have you here today and to have this conversation. So thank you for taking the time to join us.
Hey, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. And so I wanted to just sort of start off the conversation with you, sharing a little bit with our audience about sort of what has really got you into this particular research topic area and sort of why this is important.
That's a great question. So to be honest, it was not intentional. So I was a coping researcher at the beginning of my research career, and I was very much interested in understanding how African American children cope with stress in their lives. And I was particularly interested in understanding if there were unique coping strategies that Black children were using, and if there were culturally relevant coping strategies that Black children were using. Much of what we knew at that time about child and adolescent coping was based on what white middle-class youth were doing. So I was seeking to have a better understanding of coping processes across multiple domains. So if you're thinking about how young people cope, they're having to cope with something. And so that something for me was just stress in any part of their lives, whether that's family stress, school stress, stressors in the community, financial stress, peer stress. So we just covered the gamut of possible stressors in kids' lives. And I didn't really want to focus on one particular stressor because I didn't want to assume that one was more important than any other, right? However, all of the conversations that I was having with young people and families and teachers and school counselors and staff at community agencies always came back to violence in the community. And at this time, I was in Chicago, so I was doing research in Chicago. And the conversations always came back to violence in the community. And so I just felt that it was my responsibility as a researcher, as a psychologist, to listen to and elevate the voices of families and young people. And what they were saying to me was important to them. And so I decided to hone in on community violence exposure as a stressor to try to understand it a little bit better.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. You know, one of the reasons why I started Therapy for Black Kids was because of just some of the increases in racial injustice. And obviously, we've seen over history sort of how the Black community has been impacted by oppression. But I think with sort of the pandemic, as well as the sort of increase in racial uprising, I feel like we were really missing this key area for Black youth in terms of understanding their mental health and what are the multiple challenges that they face and sort of how we can sort of address this as a society. And so it's been my goal with Therapy for Black Kids to really provide this space to like continue to have conversations about these topics. And obviously, I think we've seen more discussions about mental health and more people being interested in addressing those needs. And so I think this is a really critical time for us to really engage in these types of discussions. So I'm glad to sort of hear more about how you got connected to this topic and why it sort of came up for you. You know, one of the things that has come up a lot for me in terms of the work that I've done with kids is around ACEs or adverse childhood experiences. And so we've seen lots of conversations in the media about this. And obviously, some of the data shows that children from racial and ethnic minority groups or minoritized groups are oftentimes at a greater risk of experiencing ACEs. And sometimes I think like 4 times more likely. to experience those things in terms of, witnessing violence, as you sort of spoke to, individuals that may die by suicide, different types of abuse. And so I was looking at some of your work that you've done, and sort of you've talked about the impact of community violence. And so I'm wondering, given all of these ACEs that we know about, are there any that sometimes stand out in terms of those are more likely to result in trauma or impact mental health among youth?
Yeah, it's a great question. The ACEs measure covers several different forms of trauma exposure or traumatic stress, or however you want to characterize it, adverse child experiences. And community violence, which is what I study, is one of those adverse child experiences. And so it's hard to say that one has more of an impact than another. I think that what's most harmful is the cumulative effect. So the more ACEs that you have, the more likely a child is to experience, whether those are psychological difficulties or behavioral difficulties. I think it's connected to the cumulative effect of those ACEs. The measures for the ACEs usually kind of have one question that covers whether or not kids have been exposed or someone has been exposed to community violence. And our work differs a little bit from that in that there's so many ways to be exposed to community violence. And so the measures that we use cover several different forms and types of community violence. And so it gives us a more in-depth understanding of the types of events that young people might be exposed to, whether or not there are differences across age groups or across gender identities, in terms of the types of exposure. And so if you get into that, like, are there certain types of violence, community violence exposure events that are worse than others? The issue is that we don't really have a lot of evidence that one is going to be worse or one type is going to be worse than another. So it's hard to single out one or more types of community violence events that are more likely to impact youth than other types. There's so many factors involved: the age of the child, what protective mechanisms are in place, any prior exposure that the child may have had. What's traumatic to a 7-year-old may be different than what's traumatic to a 17-year-old, right?
Yeah.
And so there's some evidence to suggest that being a victim, so being directly victimized, so being attacked, chased, shot at, beaten, may be worse than witnessing those things happening to other people. There's some evidence suggesting that violent events that involve weapons are a little more traumatic than those that do not. Also, events that involve the loss of life tend to be a little bit more traumatic than others. But again, any exposure to any one example or a violent event is more than any child should have to experience, right? Because any of these could have an impact on young people.
Yeah, one of the things that you sort of mentioned was about sort of gender differences, and when it comes to this, and so I'm wondering if you can maybe speak to that a little bit more in terms of what do you see in terms of your own work or the literature in relation to the impact of community violence on boys versus girls.
Yeah. So in our work and in other work on this topic, what they tend to find is that boys are exposed to slightly higher levels of community violence than girls are exposed to. There's some research that doesn't find any gender differences for African American youth, but there are a number of studies that do find that African American boys are exposed to more than African American girls. In terms of the differences in the impact, we haven't seen much research that gives us some clear indication that it has more of an impact on boys than it does girls, or on girls than it does boys. There's some evidence to suggest that girls are more likely to experience, what we call internalizing symptoms, so depression and anxiety, And boys are more likely to show what we call externalizing behaviors, things like aggressive behavior or disruptive behavior, but that's not completely consistent across the literature. What we do know is that both are pretty equally likely to experience post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms and also anger in response to community violence. So that seems to be pretty equivalent, those two things. And then there's some differences for depression and anxiety versus more of the aggression and disruptive behavior.
Okay, yeah, thank you for sharing that. One thing it sort of reminded me about as you were speaking earlier was that when we talk about sort of any type of ACEs and especially with community violence, that it's important to like distinguish between like what are these mental health outcomes that you mentioned, like depression or anger or symptoms. It doesn't have to be a diagnosis.
Right.
And what can be like more severe mental illness or diagnosis like PTSD or some type of trauma reaction. And so I think it's important for people to recognize that if individuals obviously, but if kids witness or experience these types of things, that they may not sort of develop, PTSD, for example, but you also want to be careful to think about these other behavioral or mental health things that may be associated with those types of experiences as well, because those may also warrant some attention and getting some help or support as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you made the distinction between diagnosis and symptoms, because that's very important. If we look at any mental health disorder, mental disorder, the prevalence rates across the population are low. You might see prevalence rates like 3%, 4%, 5%. Those are the people who meet all of the criteria for that disorder. They're displaying all of the symptoms for the designated amount of time and the designated severity to warrant a diagnosis. Right? However, there are a lot of people who don't meet the criteria for diagnosis, but are experiencing symptoms. And not only are they experiencing symptoms, but those symptoms are also impacting their daily lives. And so we see that with young people, that sometimes they don't meet the criteria for a particular diagnosis like post-traumatic stress disorder or even depression, but they're experiencing enough of those symptoms that it's having an impact on their academic functioning, how they're getting along with their peers, their behavior at home, their behavior at school, their emotions, how they feel about themselves. So I think it's important that we, as you said, don't tie this always to whether or not people have a diagnosis, and more of what's happening every day for this child. And are there disruptions to their daily life and to their functioning in ways that we want to intervene or be concerned?
Absolutely. And I'm really glad that you touched on the like school or academic pieces, because I think sometimes when we think about kids that maybe have educational problems, for example, that we don't understand like how that can be tied to other things in terms of what's going on, at home or in the community, or obviously in terms of like mental health that may be associated with some of those academic challenges too. So I think it's important for teachers and parents to have that awareness too. Like if a kid is struggling academically, it may not always be just like an educational difficulty.
Absolutely.
Maybe there's something else that needs to be sort of addressed as well, and particularly thinking about sort of mental health challenges as a result of things like community violence.
Yes, we talk about this quite a bit because ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, can look a lot like, or PTSD can look a lot like ADHD in kids. And so a lot of the work that we do has focused on one symptom of PTSD called physiological hyperarousal. That's a long name for something that means being keyed up, right? So if you think about if you're walking down the street and a car swerves and almost hits you, what your body does in response to that, your fight or flight kicks in, right? Your heart rate increases, your blood rushes to your arms and legs so that you can run or fight, whatever it is that you need to do. Your body gets ready to respond to that stressor quickly. And so what happens sometimes with people who are experiencing post-traumatic stress symptoms is they have heightened physiological arousal. It's like being in fight or flight all the time.
Mm-hmm.
That can look like ADHD because it makes it harder to concentrate, it makes it harder to sit still, it makes it harder to remember things and focus. And so what we often talk about when we talk with teachers and other educators is that before assuming that a child is just being disruptive or cannot pay attention because the child has some sort of deficit, why don't we do a trauma screening? Or why don't we try to figure out what what the child may have experienced rather than punishing them for how they're responding to what they've experienced?
Yeah, really great point. Thank you for sharing that. One of the things that I've been doing a lot of work around and sort of sharing with people, especially through this platform, is about sort of resilience and sort of, I think oftentimes when people think about kids and resilience is that, they can have these sort of bumps along the way in terms of their life, but they're going to get through it and automatically sort of recover. And sort of, I think it's important for people to recognize like resilience requires action and like you have to do some work. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm really wondering if you have some thoughts about, given what you know about community violence, what are some important considerations for parents to really think about as ways to promote positive development and resilience in youth, especially, among Black boys, as you sort of talked about, they may be at a higher risk of experiencing community violence.
Yeah, that's a great point about resilience. So resilience was my dissertation topic. So this is how I can even go back further than coping. Resilience brought me to coping, but I was really trying to understand this concept of resilience. And what we knew is that resilience is not a trait, it's a process.
Mhm.
And that process requires some action. So it doesn't just happen. Are there people that tend to be just more resilient and that they have some sort of traits that might encourage that more than other people? Probably so. But when we're thinking about how we bounce back from setbacks, how we handle adversity, it's a process, right? And there's action required. Some of the things that we know for, well, I guess in terms of thinking specifically about trauma, our violence exposure. I think it's really important for parents to learn the signs that a child may have been exposed to trauma. Of course, as a parent myself, it's like, how many things do we have to learn signs for? I know, one more thing, but it's a set of behaviors that are probably pretty easy to spot. If young people have difficulty controlling their emotions, they become very sad or angry easily, or very scared easily. They have trouble remembering, concentrating, or focusing. They're showing sleep problems or changes in appetite. They're easily distracted or jumpy, so are easily startled. They may be having some mental health challenges and even complaints of physical symptoms, but doctors can't really figure out what the cause might be for those physical symptoms, or no diagnosis, mental health diagnosis seems to fit cleanly. These might be some signs that a child has been exposed to trauma. What we know about resilience is that one of the strongest predictors of resilient outcomes is supportive relationships with a caring adult. So ensuring that the child has caring adults in their lives, parents, other relatives, it could all teachers, somebody, or if they're at a youth organization or community agency where they might spend time, that there are people there who can be supportive to them. Another thing we've also learned is that communication is critical for violence exposure. We have learned that although community violence is an important stressor in the lives of kids, meaning that it has a pretty severe impact on their functioning, a lot of the adults in their lives severely underestimate how much violence they've been exposed to in comparison to other forms of violence. So family violence, maltreatment, that often gets screened or people report that. But with community violence, we found that most adults in the lives of young people don't know how much community violence young people have been exposed to. And there are various reasons for that, which I can go into if anybody's interested. But I think what's critical is communication and open communication with kids, non-judgmental communication with kids. Make it easy for your child to ask you for support or help. You don't want your child having to engage in what I think about as risk management before they talk to you. Meaning, should I tell my parents? Should I talk to my parents? I want to talk to somebody, and they're going through kind of weighing up the pros and cons of whether or not they should talk to you. Young people have told us that they want to talk to their parents, but oftentimes when they go to their parents with issues, the parents often say, well, you shouldn't be worried about that in the first place, or that's going to be fine. Just keep moving, right? Or so they don't take the time to really listen to what's going on with them, or they kind of discount the impact that whatever the issue is having on them. Or sometimes for violence exposure, maybe kids were exposed to something out in the community because they were somewhere they should not have been, right? Or they didn't leave somewhere when they should have. Right? And so sometimes kids are really dealing with the trauma of what they saw, but they're afraid to talk to their parents because they don't want to get in trouble for being somewhere that they weren't supposed to be. So they're holding on to that. And then it's having an impact on them. So make it easy for your child to come to you when they want to talk about something. I also think limiting exposure to media, including social media. There's a lot of violent images that are shared, particularly between teenagers, so being mindful of what your child is viewing online. And also taking care of yourself as a parent. We're doing some work now on, people call it multi-generational or intergenerational, but what does multi-generational trauma or violence exposure look like? Sometimes there are events that happen in communities that have an impact on everybody. Right? Sometimes parents have seen or heard things or been victims themselves of violence, and that has an impact on the family relationship more than in some of the work we're finding than the child alone having experienced it. So taking care of yourself as a parent and recognizing when you might be experiencing some trauma. Some general things just about building positive youth development. I mentioned the positive adult connections earlier. Also, building pride in child's racial group, particularly for African American youth. We know that there's a wealth of research out there on the importance of positive racial identity. So being able to take pride in their racial group and participate in activities that are consistent with their membership in their racial ethnic group. The other, as a psychologist, and you probably know this, Dr. Turner, you spend a lot of time thinking about what's wrong with folks, right? And that's an awful way to phrase that, but I'm just, for the sake of being succinct, I'm phrasing it that way. And as a parent, you're attentive to what might be wrong because we want to fix it. We want things to be resolved so that the child can, excel. And what happens is we don't always think about what's right. And so taking time to think about, what does your child do well? What's right about your child? We spend a lot of time focused on fixing what's wrong, which is what we're supposed to do as parents. But our young people also need us to spend time nurturing what's right about them. So are there things that they really enjoy? Are there things that they're really good at? Can we find opportunities for them to enhance those interests, those skills, those things that they do well? Advocating for them in those ways are just as important as stepping in and fixing things that aren't going well.
Thank you for that. As you started speaking, I just posted in the chat the link to the APA website on racial and ethnic socialization. And so I was just like queuing that up to post it, and then you talked about the importance of thinking about that and how you can highlight for kids what's right, and then related to their race and their ethnic
Yes.
background. And I think that, that's something that I oftentimes talk about. And again, one of the reasons why I founded this and sort of curated the Instagram page is to really highlight some of these things in terms of how you can promote socialization and specifically racial socialization
Yes.
in kids. And how can you have those conversations that you talked about in terms of what's right with our kids? I think oftentimes parents don't sort of check in, like you check in when kids are like, especially teenagers, when they like close themselves in their door and they in their room and don't want to come out. And you're like,
Yes.
what's going on in there?
Yes.
But I think it's really important that you like start early having those conversations with kids just to kind of see what is going well with them. How did they enjoy school? What's going on with their sports and what other activities that they're engaging in, so that you build that connection and that relationship
Yes.
with them, so that when things aren't going right, they can sort of say, hey, mom or dad, something's going on. I need to talk with you about this. And so I
Right.
think that's really important that you establish those things so that kids do feel comfortable. Because I think especially teenagers, like they do begin to engage in a lot of that risk management stuff that you sort of talked about. Like, okay, I gotta gauge like how much is
Yes.
this going to upset
Okay.
mom and dad, and if I don't want to upset them because maybe they're dealing with some work stress or whatever, then I'm going to internalize all of these things that I
Right.
may be sort of experiencing.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you made a great point, is making sure the lines of communication are open all the time, even about these mundane things. They may be mundane to you, right? But they're really important to your child. And some of that starts as soon as they get home or when they get in the car with you. However, whenever you see them for the first time after school, listening with, as though you're listening to your friend tell you some gossip, right? I mean, you just all into it, and because a lot of times we're listening to them, but we're distracted. We're scrolling on our phones, and they're talking about their day, and they know you're not listening to them. They know we're not listening when we do that. And so, really being attentive, asking questions. We don't always want to know why such and such sat next to such and such at lunch. I, we don't really care, do we? Or what happened on the playground? But for them, that may have been the most important part of their day. And so when you're attentive to those little things for them, then they're more like, you're building those connections. So they're more likely to come to you with things that are challenging for them to talk about. I tell parents, I have a rule. My kids are in the car, I'm not on the phone.
Mhm.
I can be on the phone remote. I mean, I'm not holding the phone, right? It's Bluetooth. But I can be on the phone up until the moment they get in the car, no matter where we're coming from. And then I'm off the phone. Right? Giving them, and sometimes my daughter, she has her headphones in, she's a teenager, she has her headphones in, she may not say anything for a few minutes, and that's okay. But she knows that whenever she's ready to say something, that I'm ready to listen.
Mhm. Really important. So really helpful information, some comments in the chat. I'm appreciating your knowledge that you're dropping today. Really helpful information and resources. As we begin to sort of wrap up, I will post in the chat the link to the website here for parents that may be interested in finding therapists for their kids. There are some resources on that link that I posted so that you can sort of find more information there. Also, just sort of letting people know that we will be hosting the next event in March. So stay tuned for that information on the website, or you can join the mailing list to get information about that as well. And then as we just sort of close out, I wanted to just sort of open it up for you, Dr. Noni, to see if there were any additional resources or information that you wanted to share with parents that might be helpful.
Just search for them. Did that go in? The National Child Traumatic Stress Network has a lot of resources for supporting young people who have been exposed to trauma. And it has resources that are organized by teachers, parents, other folks who might be clinicians who might want to support young people. There's also the National Black Child Development Institute that has resources and suggestions for supporting Black youth. I was also going to mention this amazing website called Therapy for Black Kids that helps young people, parents find therapists in their area, but also provides valuable resources to parents. So I think Dr. Turner has already dropped that in the chat, but that is also an amazing resource for parents who may be seeking more information.
So I want to thank you again, Dr. Noni, for taking the time to share with us today and dropping this knowledge that's really helpful. I have a couple of quotable things that I've written down myself today, especially about the process versus the trait piece, which I thought was really excellent to really think about. So we'll wrap up here today again. Thank you all for taking the time to join us. I appreciate the questions and the comments from all of you that found this event helpful. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Take
Thank you
care.
for having me. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your comments and questions.
Absolutely. Take care.